Hey guys, today we're going to be doing a short wrap-up video about the effects of westward expansion on the United States. Just 3 questions for today's video, but they're pretty important. How did western migration affect the Native American population? How did the Western climate give an advantage to free states over slave states? And how could an upset in the balance between the number of free states and the number of slave states possibly lead to war or to the breakup of the United States? All right, so between 1845 and 1850, a pretty short period of time, we see a rapid growth in both territory and in the western population of the United States. So in 1845, you can see what the United States looked like up in the top right-hand corner of the screen. It's pretty much just east of the Mississippi is settled. All those pink areas have a lot of American people actually living in them. All the rest of that territory, that brown territory you see there, is basically populated only by Native Americans, and maybe like a few Americans here and there, but it's mostly still wilderness. But so America goes from looking like that, basically just the eastern half of the continent, to looking like it does in the bottom of the screen there in 1850. Texas, California, New Mexico, Oregon, all of that is added to the United States. So it's basically like 33% of our total landmass is added in just 5 years. And on top of that, we're not just adding land, but American people are starting to move out and to settle in that territory. And by 1850, both Texas and California are becoming heavily populated areas. This is important, one, because it connects the United States to the Pacific Ocean, which allows us to trade with Asia. It also provides a huge amount of natural resources, stuff like rich farmland, vast forests, and rich deposits of gold and oil, all of which will eventually be used back in the east of the United States as our economy continues to grow and develop. So it's a pretty big deal, and it increases the total strength of the United States in terms of both territory, population, and resources. So one major thing that's happening besides just expanding the territory is the shift of the American population into all of this new western territory. Lots of settlers, many of them using covered wagons like the one you see here, head west from the settled parts of the United States into new territories in Texas, California, and Oregon. These guys help to spread American culture to new regions and begin to supply valuable resources to the rest of the United States. But this shift has huge consequences for Native Americans living out west. You might remember that before this happened, Native Americans had been taken out of the east of the United States and moved westward. And basically, back then, people thought that Americans would never want to live out west, so they figured that would be a good place for Native Americans to live. But now, what with Manifest Destiny and all, as white settlers are moving westward, it means that there's basically nowhere left for Native Americans to go. They can't go further west because people are settling in California. They can't go further east because there are already people there, so they're kind of stuck. And what this leads to is a long series of wars between the United States government and Native American populations. And unsurprisingly, the Native Americans usually lose. They don't have the resources, they don't have the technology to fight back against the United States. And over the period of time from like 1850 to 1900, Native Americans are pretty much wiped out across all of the west of the United States and forced into tiny, undesirable patches of land called reservations. This area is reserved for Native Americans. And so this is pretty brutal, and it borders on like racial extermination. Basically, the United States is getting rid of the Native Americans. That way, white settlers can have their land. And it's a huge humanitarian crime that doesn't get talked about enough in American history, which is why I'm talking about it right now. There are other negative consequences besides the extermination of Native Americans. One is the growing sectional conflict. Now, sectional refers to the sections of the United States, the North and the South. And so the westward expansion leads to conflict between the North and the South. Basically, if the Western expansion hadn't occurred, the balance between the North and the South might have stayed in place, and it would have been possible to avoid this growing conflict. But with westward expansion, it's basically the last nail in the coffin for the balance between free states and slave states. And the reason for this is that the climate out west doesn't work for slavery. For slavery to work, you have to have a warm climate with rich soils in which you can grow cash crops like sugar or cotton. And the green area in this map here, all of that green area has the proper climate for growing stuff like that. It's warm, the soils are good, you can grow stuff like cotton in that area. All these other territories are either too cold or too dry for slavery to work well. And so you'll see that almost all of the territory that is added by the Mexican Cession and partially by the annexation of Texas and by the Oregon Treaty is territory that will not work for slavery. And so since it won't work for slavery, it basically promises that all of this territory will eventually become a free state. And so if you add all of those states in as free states, the balance is tipped way, way to one side towards free states. And so because slavery can't spread anywhere else, it's basically doomed because the free states are slowly going to increase in number and gain power. But so why is this important? Why does it matter so much that the free states are eventually going to outnumber the slave states? Well, I'll tell you. The reason it mattered why the slave states were eventually going to be outnumbered was that the slave states and the free states basically wanted opposite things. Slave states wanted a low tariff because they wanted to trade internationally, especially with Great Britain, while the free states wanted a high tariff because they had factories and they wanted to protect their factories from competition, especially with England. So they wanted exact opposite economic goals to be achieved. Second, slave states wanted a small government. Basically, they just wanted to be left alone and be left to grow cotton in peace. Northern states wanted a big government that helped industry to develop, helped to build railroads, and stuff like that. That all stuff that doesn't really help the South. That's another opposition of goals. The southern states wanted to continue to expand slavery to new areas. They even thought about trying to conquer the islands in the Caribbean and to spread slavery there. But the free states were starting to think that slavery was wrong, and they wanted to spread more free states rather than allow slavery to spread. So once again, they have exact opposite ideas on this issue. So because they have opposite ideas, it means that if any one side gains power, it's going to make the other side angry. But so up until this point, there had been a balance between free states and slave states, which meant that neither side could really do very much, and neither side could really get what it wanted. But that kept them from fighting. But as soon as one side gains power and has more votes, it's going to get what it wants. So like when California comes in as a free state, this gives the free states the power to pass a high tariff, to have a bigger government, and to continue to expand, increase the number of free states. And when this happens, it's going to make the other side upset, because if one side gets what it wants, the other side's not getting what it wants. And this side, if it gets too upset, might try to secede. That is, to leave the United States and start its own country. If one side tries to secede, the other side is probably going to try and fight a war in order to stop it, because it's going to want to keep the nation together in order to keep the nation strong. But any possible war between the North and South, any possible conflict between these two sections of the United States, promises to be terribly bloody and costly. And so that's why the free state-slave state balance is important. Because if the balance is not maintained, the road to civil war is paved. And that's what starts to happen around 1850 when California comes in as a free state. The balance is tipped towards the free states start to do what they want, and the slave states start to think about seceding from the Union, which they eventually do in 1860. We're done. That's all we're going to say about Western expansion. Thanks for listening, and make sure you can answer these questions.